Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AWSELVA's Winter Conference. Thank you for joining us this morning. For those of you not familiar with AWSELVA, we are the Animal Welfare Science, Ethics and Law Veterinary Association. We exist to bring together those different disciplines and create somewhere where we can talk about the issues and how they relate together in the hope of enacting positive change for animals and people who work with animals. So today our conference is about trophy hunting, which is a bit of a departure for us. We normally cover more domestic issues in our conferences, but we thought it was relevant because it covers law, policy, forensics, and of course animal welfare. It's one of the most controversial and divisive issues that we've covered, but as an independent voice, we wanted to create a discussion on the issue. Not everyone might agree with what we talk about today, and we all agree that it's a complex, wicked problem. But we hope to move the issue along some way by discussing some of the recent developments in this area and raise some awareness of a non-domestic issue. So today we have with us Eduardo Goncalves from the Campaign to End Trophy Hunting, Dr. Mark Jones from the Born Free Foundation, Dr. Tanya Wyatt from Northumbria University, and Professor Geoff Beattie from Edge Hill University. So just some notes about today's meeting. It's being recorded and will be available on AWSELVA's YouTube channel afterwards. All participants are on mute. We would like to encourage lots of questions from participants so that we can have a really well-rounded discussion. At the end of everybody's talks, we will be holding a panel discussion. So if you could put some questions in the chat function, then we can put those questions to the panelists at the end of the session. You can use a chat box or you can send a message directly to me. There's also the function to raise your hand in the reactions function at the bottom. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Eduardo Goncalves. So in 2018, Eduardo established and is CEO of the Campaign to End Trophy Hunting. He was previously CEO of the League Against Cruel Sports, also International Communications Director at the Climate Group and Director of Abu Dhabi's Environment Agency. He has very broad experience in raising the issue of trophy hunting in the media and also the political landscape. So thank you, Eduardo, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and thank you indeed for organising this event today, and to AWSELVA for organising this, and welcome everyone this morning. So if we could have the first slide. So the first question, I guess, is really, why has trophy hunting suddenly become an issue in Britain? Why has there been all of this media coverage? Why is it such a hot political issue? And why indeed are people taking to the streets, certainly in pre-COVID times, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Because surely, isn't trophy hunting something that's done by Americans? We remember Walter Palmer here, the American dentist who shot Cecil the lion, and quite often we see images on social media of other Americans who shoot giraffes and elephants, and they stand next to the bodies and grin next to their newfound souvenirs of animals that they've shot for sport. And that's predominantly the image that many people have. Next slide, please. But the reality is actually somewhat different. And the fact is that British hunters are shooting these animals as well. And this is really what has started to happen in the last couple of years, is that we've become more aware. So, for example, this chap is called Manish Gelabai. He's a gas engineer from Norfolk. This is a canned lion that he shot. So it'd been bred in captivity and was shot in a fenced-in enclosure. In fact, the animal was pretty tame. Manish likes to boast that he got as close as 8 yards to this lion before he shot it, and that's because the lion didn't recognize him as a threat or in any way, and probably thought that he was coming to bring some dinner. Next slide, please. This is Ian Evans, who's a farmer from Scotland with an elephant that he shot. In fact, Britain is one of the top 12 nations in the world when it comes to trophy hunting of elephants, so the numbers of elephants that are shot and the amount of ivory, including tusks, that trophy hunters bring home. And in fact, elephants are the most popular of the CITES listed species amongst British trophy hunters by some margin. Hippos are the second place one. There's quite a gap between elephants and hippos. Next slide, please. And here we have a hippo. This is a chap called Jimmy Jordan, who's posted various pictures of himself on social media with various animals that he's shot. He shot this hippo in South Africa with a company called Umlilo Safaris, which is one of many companies that's used by British trophy hunters. Next slide, please. And the chap standing up in this picture is called Charlie Reynolds. He runs a road haulage business. I think it's down in Bristol. And this is a photo of him with a giraffe that he shot. There's several other British trophy hunters who have emerged in the media recently, having shot giraffes. Asif Watu, who's a customer services manager for Thames Water, being another one. Next slide, please. And on the left, we've got a chap called Mickey Jordan, no relation to Jimmy Jordan, with a vervet monkey. And on the right, Jimmy Metherell, who goes hunting with his wife often in South Africa with a baboon that he's shot. And actually primates are very popular amongst British trophy hunters, particularly Shakma baboons, Hamadryas baboons, yellow baboons, but vervet monkeys are also very popular. And you can shoot them very cheaply, as indeed you can baboons. Something like 500 trophies of primate species have been brought back to Britain by British trophy hunters in the past few years. Next slide, please. The chap in the middle, he's called Colin Brooks. He runs a manufacturing engineering business in Cambridgeshire. In fact, he's recently retired with one of the zebras that he's shot. So Hartman's mountain zebras, again, one of the top 10 animals that are shot by British trophy hunters. They also shoot Birchall zebras. And in fact, we produced a newspaper recently that we were giving to commuters in London, and there was a lot of photos of British trophy hunters with zebras. So zebras are very popular with British trophy hunters. Next slide, please. This is Rodney Fuller, who's a farmer with a caracal cat. So British trophy hunters, as well as shooting the big five, they shoot all sorts of other small and medium-sized cats, so wild cats, bobcats, Canada lynxes, Eurasian lynxes, serval cats, as well as caracals. Next slide, please. Now, this is a chap called Paul Rogers. He's a gun maker from Sussex. He has shot black rhino. I don't have a picture of him with the black rhino, but he has shot a black rhino. He's been on 33 African safaris. He's shot some very, very large lions and leopards and elephants, some of which qualify for the award schemes which the hunting industry gives. So there's, for example, the Safari Club International Record Book, which lists all the big animals that are shot by trophy hunters and actually encourages people to shoot them and tells you where you can go to shoot them. So there's also the Roland Ward scheme, which was actually set up by a British hunting company about a century ago. And I know that some of his animals would have qualified for Roland Ward schemes prizes. Next slide, please. This is Malcolm King. He's a British property developer. He owns homes in Gloucester and Jersey. He has won literally dozens of prizes with Safari Club International for shooting at large numbers of animals. So, for example, I think he's won the Hunting Achievement Award at diamond level, which means you have to have shot animals from at least 125 different species. In all, he's estimated to have killed the equivalent of 300 animals, thereabouts. He recently came runner-up in the Weatherby Award, which is very much the Oscar of the whole trophy hunting industry. So the person who wins the Weatherby Award is generally regarded to be the world's top trophy hunter at that time, and he came runner-up to a chap called Jose Pepe Madrazo, who's a Spanish hunter who's shot 390 animals. Next slide, please. This is Abigail Day. She has been given the Diana Prize by Safari Club International. So that's given to the world's top female trophy hunter. And she now, as a result of being given that award a few years ago, she's now the chair of the committee of Safari Club International, which hands out this award to some of the women that you've probably heard of, people like Larissa Switcliffe and Olivia Oprah, who in fact she co-chairs that committee with. Next slide, please. So as well as being fairly prolific trophy hunters of their own rights, there's a lot of British companies that are offering trophy hunting holidays in Africa and indeed elsewhere. So the chap here is called Alex Goss. He runs a company called Blackthorn Safaris, which is based in Oswestry, which is today famous as the capital of the North Shropshire constituency, where there was a by-election yesterday. So here he has a lioness that was bred in captivity and has been shot in a fenced-in enclosure. They also offer hunting holidays for hippos and zebras and many other species. Next slide, please. The chap on the right is called Carl Knight. He's from Epsom in Surrey. He runs a company called Take Aim Safaris, which operates in 4 different countries in Southern Africa. This is a leopard that he's helped his clients to shoot. He himself boasts of having been on 400 big game hunts during his time. He recently sent out a newsletter a few months ago saying that as a result of COVID, and of course not many people traveling to Africa, that his animals were rested and ready for trophy hunters to come and shoot them again. Next slide, please. The chap on the left is called Derek Stocker. So he runs a company called ProStalk that's based in Glastonbury. He sells elephant hunts for £20,000. He also sells vervet monkey hunts for as little as £47. And the chap on the right is Robin Hurt, who's the owner of Robin Hurt Safaris. So again, British born and it's a British owned company. He lives in Namibia now. Robin Hurt Safaris is one of the biggest record-breaking companies in the world. So it has literally hundreds of entries in the Safari Club International record book. Robin Hurt himself tried to offer me a cheetah hunt holiday a few months ago. Next slide, please. There's a number of African companies who have British sales agents or marketing directors. So essentially they have people in the UK whose job it is to market their hunting holidays to British trophy hunters. So the chap on the left, whose face you can see, is called David Watt, and he's an agent for Nduna Safaris, which offers, amongst other things, hunts in juvenile lions, so sub-adult lions. And here he is with a lioness that's been bred in captivity. Next slide, please. And Britain also has a number of leading taxidermists to the British hunting industry. So this lion was stuffed by a chap called Will Matthews, who owns and runs an operation in Buckinghamshire. The lion itself was shot by a British businessman called Ernie Colici. It was shot, I think, in 2019. Ernie Colici actually died last year of COVID. He's the owner of the sort of ice cream and sort of boutique cafe brand. They've got a network of shops and so on. He, in fact, has extended, shortly before he died, he had extended his house in order to create a new trophy room for animals such as this lion. Next slide, please. Will Matthews isn't alone. So there's a chap called Paul Taylor in Dorchester who does a lot of jobs for British hunters. So here's a leopard. He's also done bears. He's done hippos, baboons, and various other animals. Next slide, please. So that's just to sort of give you a picture that although we often think that Britain isn't the biggest contributor to the, if you like, the trophy hunting market, and yeah, obviously the Americans are far, far bigger, but it is not one that one can discount. And if you look at the figures for from the CITES trade database, so since the 1980s, British hunters have brought back to Britain some 5,000 trophies of CITES listed species. Now, the total number may be considerably higher because, as I say, these are just CITES listed species. Therefore, this is where we have the data from the CITES trade database. There are, of course, many other animals that British trophy hunters like to shoot where you don't require a CITES import or export permit. And so the data about that, we simply don't know. But if we look at the estimates from both IUCN, but also from I4 and other organizations, which suggest that the total number of trophies is around 3 to 5 times as much as the CITES listed trophy trade, then we could be looking at somewhere between 15 to 25,000 hunting trophies being brought back to the UK since the 80s. If we take a snapshot of 2019, so obviously just before COVID and 2020, there have been far fewer, but there were still trophies coming back to Britain in 2020, including of lions and elephants and leopards and so on. But if we take a fairly normal year, so 2019, so 234 trophies, again, of CITES listed species, plus an additional 19 kilograms of elephant tusks. So the animals that came back in 2019 included lions, some of which were wild lions, some were canned lions, also elephants, leopards, giraffes, but there's also some what you might call perhaps slightly unusual creatures, so hyenas, honey badgers, wild sheep, and so on. And if you look at the last few years, the list of animals that British hunters have shot includes polar bears, wildcats, wolves, cheetahs, North American river otters, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the 10 most popular animals that have been shot by British trophy hunters over that same period. So as you can see, the African elephant is the top animal. This again, CITES listed species, and by some margin, followed by hippos. Then there's black bears. Black bears are, there's a huge market in black bear trophy hunting. In fact, in some years, largely because of black bears, Canada is actually the largest exporter of hunting trophies. Canada is also the only country that still allows polar bear trophy hunting to take place. Both the US and Russia have stopped that some years ago. And as you can see, the list goes right down to include leopards, zebras, lions, baboons, antelopes, crocodiles, and so on. I think that's probably the last of my slides, just simply to say, well, where we are in Britain at the moment. So this is actually a poster that we launched last week outside Parliament. So the government, it did in 2019 in the Queen's speech and then in its election manifesto say that it would introduce a ban on imports of trophies from endangered species. Just last week, the government announced some details of its plans. There's obviously been some delay. A couple of years has passed and we've had a public consultation now. But anyway, it has now come forward with its proposals. And what the proposals will encompass will be species that are covered by the CITES appendices 1 and 2, but also anything else that's on the IUCN red list that's been missed off CITES because some animals are, such as buffaloes, and until recently giraffes were as well. So from the near threatened category upwards. So what that means in practice, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild. And yes, there are animals that are shot by trophy hunters that are extinct in the wild. So for example, the scimitar horned oryx being one example that where you can go to ranches in America and South Africa to shoot that animal, although it's disappeared from its natural range in Central Africa. So anyway, that means that it is a pretty comprehensive ban. It's not a total ban, which perhaps we might have preferred, because certainly I see this as primarily a moral and ethical issue. And that's actually the view of the British public as well. So when there have been a number of opinion polls on this, and people have been asked, do you support or not support trophy hunting? Do you think it should be banned, or should they just be banned for endangered species? And the response has always been sort of 85% thereabouts, that actually people want all trophy hunting to end, and they want a ban on all imports of hunting trophies. And in fact, this was also the conclusion of the DEFRA public consultation. So something like 84, I think, % of people said that they preferred option 3, which was one of the options of one of the 4 options that was put forward by the government. And that was the total ban option. The option of just endangered species received a much, much smaller level of support. So the government has, I think, largely as a result of the public consultation, but also, its dialogue with different organizations, it's decided to expand the the remit of the ban to include pretty much most of the animals that are shot by British trophy hunters. We don't know when this legislation is going to come to Parliament, although the ministers have said that they are looking hopefully to bring that to the House of Commons in the spring or the summer of next year. So I hope that's been a useful introduction on the issue and what is happening in Britain at the moment. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. That was really fascinating. So our next speaker is Mark Jones. And just before I introduce Mark, just a reminder to everybody who's joined to submit questions to the chat function. So you can do this throughout the presentations today. And you can direct a question at an individual speaker or to the group as a whole, and it can be something that's been covered in the speaker's talk, or if you just want to find out more information about something, then please do put questions into the chat. So our next speaker is Dr. Mark Jones from the Born Free Foundation. Dr. Jones trained as a vet at Liverpool University and has worked for many years in fish health and disease control before working on rescue and rehabilitation projects for primates, bears, birds, reptiles in South America and Asia. And he joined the Born Free Foundation in 2014, where he is currently head of policy. And over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Sarah. I hope you can hear me okay. Good morning, everyone. And many thanks to AWSELVA for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. And thank you all for logging in on this Friday morning. Next slide, please. So before I start, I just wanted to say a quick word about the organisation I work for. Born Free was founded in 1984 by the actors Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers and their son Will. And the charity was named after the classic 1966 film the actors starred in, which told the story of conservationists Joy and George Adamson and their experience rescuing a lioness cub called Elsa and successfully returning her to the wild in Kenya. The charity was originally called Zoo Check and was very much focused when it was founded on highlighting the plight of wild animals in zoos and other captive facilities and the associated welfare concerns. Next slide, please. So while these days Born Free has expanded its activities to include field conservation projects, education, and policy work, the charity has always retained its core focus on the welfare and well-being of individual animals and continues to promote the incorporation of animal welfare considerations into all human activities and policies that involve or affect wildlife. And to that end, our mission is to end the exploitation and suffering of wild animals, protect wild animals, habitats and ecosystems, and inspire compassion and respect for wild animals. Next slide, please. We tend to focus on keystone species, including big cats, elephants, rhinos, great apes, and so on, the successful conservation and protection of which provides protected habitats for countless other species. And our projects are managed and run wherever possible by local people in the countries in which we work. And I think it's worth noting that several of these focus species for us are species that are subject to trophy hunting across parts of their range. Next slide, please. So I should really start by saying that Born Free is ethically opposed to the killing of wild animals for sport or pleasure, whether they're wild born or bred in captivity. But we also challenge the claims made by proponents of trophy hunting that the activity delivers significant or irreplaceable financial benefits for conservation or local communities, or that it positively contributes to the sustainable use of wildlife. We strive to highlight the negative impacts of trophy hunting and sport hunting activities on the conservation and welfare of animals to policymakers and to the wider public. And it's these conservation impacts and animal welfare concerns that I really want to try and focus on today. Next slide, please. Recreational hunting is a centuries-old activity, but the modern practice of trophy hunting really emerged among Europeans during the colonial era. and in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century. Over subsequent decades, the desire among wealthy elite hunters to bag trophy animals had devastating impacts on populations of many iconic and keystone species, particularly but not exclusively across South Asia and East Africa. In more recent years, trophy hunters have continued to cover a large range of species. For the decade from 2011 to 2020, more than 300,000 trophy items derived from more than 300 species listed on the appendices of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, were exported by 112 countries, and they included more than 40,000 brown bear trophies, 38,000 African elephant trophies, and 11,000 lion trophies, among many others. And the major destinations for these trophies were the United States, which accounted for about 36%, and with European Union countries, which included the UK for that decade, being destinations for around 23% of those trophies. Now, as well as Eduardo pointed out, it's important to remember that these figures only represent exports of trophies from species that are threatened with extinction, the international trade in which is regulated by CITES. Data on non-CITES listed species and data on domestic trophy hunting is much, much harder to come by. But when you factor this in, the true number of trophy animals being hunted is much, much higher than these figures suggest. The issue has increasingly come to public attention in recent years. I think because of increased awareness of the plight of various species, concerns about the value we place on the heads of animals, and skepticism around the claims hunting proponents make for the conservation or local community benefits derived from hunting. And of course, the killing of Cecil the lion in Zimbabwe 6 years ago by an American dentist generated a great deal of public outrage and concern about the ethics and sustainability of trophy hunting and about the animal suffering involved. So I think it's fair to say that trophy hunting has certainly become a very contentious issue in recent years, as Sarah indicated in her introduction today. Next slide, please. Proponents of trophy hunting often claim the activity provides benefits for species conservation and local communities that live alongside wildlife. Some of those claims include that trophy hunting is already well regulated through international agreements and national rules and quotas, that the money generated by trophy hunting is essential for wildlife authorities and local communities living in areas where trophy hunting takes place, that trophy hunting provides value from wild animals, incentivizing local people and policymakers to maintain areas for wildlife that might otherwise be converted for other uses, that trophy hunting is an effective and sustainable way of managing wild animal populations and removing problem or redundant animals, and that the carcasses of trophy hunted animals provide essential food for local communities. However, studies and reports, sorry, can you move back to the previous slide? Thank you, Denise. Studies and reports have increasingly questioned the economic, conservation and societal values of trophy hunting activities and its sustainability. Far from being well regulated, animal populations are often manipulated and quotas set to maximize profits. Recommended age-based and area-based limitations are frequently ignored. Hunting levels often exceed quotas, and much of the revenue generated from trophy hunting ends up in the hands of hunting concession operators, officials, and foreign companies. And when it comes to current regulations, CITES and most national wildlife trade regulations do not address the moral and ethical objections to trophy hunting or its impact on animal welfare, which I believe are the main issues of concern to the wider public. In my view, they also frequently fail to effectively address what they are designed to ensure, namely the sustainability of the activity. CITES quotas for trophy exports are frequently not based on robust scientific information for key species, and exporting or importing authorities frequently fail to adequately assess whether key requirements such as legal acquisition and demonstrable non-detriment to the target population have been met when issuing permits for the export or import of hunting trophies. And back in 2019, we released a report entitled Busting the Myths and Exposing the Cruelty, which provides detailed analysis and evidence for our concerns, and you can find that on Born Free's website. Next slide, please. When considering the conservation impacts of trophy hunting, firstly, it's important to remember that far from removing surplus or decrepit animals, or those considered to be a threat or a nuisance, trophy hunters typically covet the animals that make the best trophies. So lions with the darkest manes, elephants with the longest tusks, and so on. And I think Professor Beattie is going to talk more later about what motivates trophy hunters. Far from being surplus or redundant, these animals are often key individuals within their societies and the wider ecosystem, and their removal can have profound conservation implications that go way beyond the simple numerical impact on the animals, affecting the social, behavioural and genetic integrity of wider family groups and populations. Secondly, because hunters value rarity and are often prepared to pay more, in some cases a great deal more, to hunt rare animals, threatened species may be disproportionately targeted, increasing the pressure on already vulnerable populations and potentially pushing them towards localized extinction. As far back as 2006, researchers suggested that hunting pressures may increase as species become increasingly threatened because of increased value in the eyes of the hunters, leading to what they described as an anthropogenic allele effect, where disproportionate exploitation of the rarest species can have harmful consequences. Also, trophy hunting agents and outfitters often sell packages, which may include the preferred target animal, such as one of the so-called big five African species, but also several other animals from lesser target species, often prey species such as antelope, zebra, or ostrich. And the killing of large numbers of prey species, some of which may not be well protected or subject to strict quotas, can skew populations and affect predator-prey relationships. The trophy hunting industry has also been implicated in the trafficking of wildlife through so-called pseudo-hunting, where trophy hunting has been used as a front to facilitate the acquisition and export of valuable parts of protected animals for illegal commercial trade, including rhino horn, for example. And back in January 2018, the new Environment Minister of Tanzania accused hunting operators of being involved in poaching and illegal exports of ivory. Such associations further undermine the credibility of the trophy hunting industry's conservation claims and place vulnerable wildlife populations at increased risk. Next slide, please. I'll try and illustrate these concerns by looking at three examples of species, the hunting of which is permitted in some African countries, starting with leopards. Leopards are vulnerable to extinction and in pretty serious decline across much of their range. They were listed on CITES Appendix 1 in 1975, meaning that commercial international trade in leopards is banned. However, the export of leopard hunting trophies and skins for personal use continues under a quota system that's been administered by CITES since 1997. And currently 12 countries have annual quotas, and more than 6,500 leopard trophies were declared to have been exported over the past decade, almost a quarter of which were destined for EU countries. However, CITES quotas for leopard trophies are not based on reliable or verifiable population data, which simply doesn't exist for some of the countries that allow them to be hunted. And guidance on establishing non-detriment findings for trade in leopard hunting trophies, mandated by a specific decision at CITES from 2019, has yet to be produced. The 2015 IUCN Red List leopard assessment recognises that if poorly managed, trophy hunting can be detrimental to the population, especially when permits are focused in one geographic area and targeted individuals are in their prime, territorial and reproductively active. A number of recent studies have questioned the sustainability of leopard trophy hunting under the current system. One such study examined CITES leopard quotas and concluded that the current regime largely fails to meet the general principles of precaution, sustainable use and adaptive management. Others reported that 87% of professional hunters surveys who have hunted in Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia or Zimbabwe responded that they were willing to hunt an adult female leopard. And a third study examined the effects of trophy hunting and other human activities on leopards and highlighted disruption to subadult male leopard dispersal as a result of hunting, with potential consequences for the future viability and genetic viability of populations. 2 of the countries that have leopard hunting quotas don't even have a management plan in place for the species. In spite of all of this, leopards continue to be legally hunted by trophy hunters, which begs the question how credible non-government findings can be. Next slide, please. When it comes to elephants, big tusker African bull elephants have declined precipitously as a result of targeting by trophy hunters and poachers, with the loss of all that accumulated social knowledge and experience, as well as genes that may be hugely important for herd health. A recent study found that male elephants increase their energetic allocation into reproduction with age as the probability of reproductive success increases, and that man-made interference, such as trophy hunting and poaching, could drive fundamental changes in elephant reproductive tactics. Removal of the biggest tuskers, who are the prime targets for trophy hunters, effectively removes the most reproductively successful bulls, with inevitable negative consequences for natural selection processes and future population health and viability. Far from being redundant, older bull elephants also help to control younger males in bachelor groups whose behaviour may become less predictable when older bulls are removed, with the resulting potential for increased conflict with people. And the influence of elephants on the habitats and ecosystems of which they are a part has also been shown to provide important services by way, for example, of carbon sequestration. Studies by the International Monetary Fund estimate that each individual forest elephant may be responsible for activities that result in carbon capture worth more than $1.75 million throughout that elephant's lifetime. So taking out individual elephants before their time results in a loss of these kind of vital services. Next slide, please. And with regard to lions and other species coveted by trophy hunters, there are also serious issues. In a 2016 paper, researchers noted that trophy hunting has had negative effects on lion populations throughout Africa, and that hunting resulted in population declines over a 25-year period for all continuous harvest strategies, particularly where males under 7 years old are targeted. The authors concluded that age-restricted harvesting is probably not sufficient to guarantee sustainability. Bear in mind the widely used minimum age limit for lion trophies is 6 years. The collapse of lion populations in the Central African Republic was well documented well before civil war or trophy import bans, despite that country fully embracing trophy hunting. Burkina Faso has the highest lion hunting trophy, had the highest lion hunting quota in Africa for a long time, yet the lion populations continue to decline, and the quota has now collapsed, as it has in Benin. Quotas have had to be reduced in Cameroon, and Ethiopia no longer issues a quota. The only conclusion that we can draw from this is that trophy hunting has completely failed to result in sustainable management in these countries and may well have contributed to the continued decline of lions. Removing older male lions who control prides may also lead to younger males killing the previous incumbents' cubs, so as to be able to breed themselves, and that can have serious implications for the cubs themselves, obviously, and the adult females who care for them. A recent study of the impact of a 3-year moratorium on hunting around South Luangwa National Park in Zambia demonstrated that the moratorium resulted in significant growth of the Luangwa lion population, with more cubs being born each year during the moratorium than while trophy hunting was taking place. And the moratorium also resulted in the recovery from a male depleted population to a more balanced demographic structure. Trophy hunting may also result in parts and products derived from hunted animals being made available for international trade, which can stimulate demand and have negative consequences for lion individuals and populations. The increasing international trade in lion bones over recent years has been identified as an emerging threat to the species and has to a significant extent been fueled by the supply of skeletal products from lions that have been killed in trophy hunts. Leopards, elephants and lions are just 3 of the many species that are at conservation risk and are subject to trophy hunting. For these species and the vast majority of others, we simply don't understand enough about the impact of taking targeted animals out of populations in order to make informed judgments about the activity's sustainability. So we would therefore argue that through a carefully managed transition, ending trophy hunting could have positive impacts on species conservation. Next slide, please. As a veterinarian, I believe trophy hunting also has serious animal welfare implications. In most circumstances where animals are deliberately killed, for example, domestic animals for food, convention and legal provisions demand that the methods used should minimize negative welfare impacts and that operatives must be trained and subject to oversight. However, no such requirements apply to trophy hunters. Not only are trophy hunters not trained professionals, they are also after a good quality trophy and may therefore use methods that avoid damaging specific parts of the animal that will subsequently be displayed as the trophy, such as the head. And this can increase the chances of a protracted and painful death for the target animal. There are high-profile examples of animals being targeted by trophy hunters that have been wounded, only to be tracked and killed hours or even days later. Trophy hunting organisations offer awards for unconventional methods of killing a trophy animal, which might include the use of bows and arrows, handguns, or traditional weapons such as muzzle loaders. And these methods clearly don't prioritise the welfare of the target animal. Both Cecil the lion, killed in Zimbabwe in 2015, and Mopani the lion, killed in the same area in similar circumstances earlier this year, were reportedly targeted by American trophy hunters using bows and arrows, and were both reportedly initially wounded by the hunters and only killed some time later. Additionally, target animals may be pursued for long periods of time, in some cases days during hunts. Individuals may be separated from family groups or populations, which can result in considerable stress. And in some cases, target animals may be deliberately lured into areas where the presence of potential predators or competitors might also cause distress, as was the case for both Cecil and Mopani, who were reportedly lured out of a protected area into an area where they could be targeted by hunters. Some forms of trophy hunting involve the exploitation of wild animals in captive situations. A clear example is so-called canned hunting, where animals are typically bred in captivity to be released into an enclosed area where they're targeted by paying hunters and where there's no chance of escape. The breeding of lions and other predators for this purpose in South Africa has resulted in an industry that currently involves more than 300 facilities and maybe as many as 12,000 animals. This has created a host of additional animal welfare concerns related to the conditions in which the animals are bred and maintained. And there have been a number of high-profile reports of serious animal abuse and neglect relating to South Africa's lion breeding farms. In the veterinary profession, we like to talk a lot about preventing unnecessary suffering. It seems quite clear to me that the suffering caused by trophy hunting is entirely preventable and completely unnecessary. And alongside my colleague, Dr. Chris Draper, I co-authored a book chapter entitled Trophy Hunting and Animal Welfare, which was published in 2018 and which contains a great deal more detail about these animal welfare concerns. And I'd be happy to share a link to that if that was of interest to people on the call. Next slide, please. A number of countries, including Brazil, Costa Rica, and Kenya, have banned trophy hunting. Some others, including the likes of Israel, Australia, France, and to some extent the US, have introduced bans or restrictions on the import of certain types of trophies. As we've heard already, the UK is far from being the largest importer of wildlife trophies. Nevertheless, over the past decade, more than 2,000 trophies from threatened and protected species, including elephants, hippos, zebra, leopards, lions, bears, and baboons and other primates have been imported by UK-based trophy hunters. Next slide, please. Public opinion polls have consistently shown strong public support for a UK ban on trophy imports. And in its 2019 election manifesto, the Conservative Party promised to end the import of hunting trophies. The government ran a public consultation on the issue in early 2020. Now, we've encouraged government to move ahead with a ban since we believe this would reflect the wishes of the majority of the public, and do not believe the current regulations and their implementation are sufficiently robust to ensure the protection of threatened species. Next slide, please. So, as we've heard, last Friday, DEFRA finally released a summary of the responses it received to the public consultation and its intentions going forward. And these include a ban on imports of trophies from species listed on Annex A and B of the UK Wildlife Trade Regulations. They reflect the CITES Appendix 1 and 2 lists, covering about 6,000 species. In addition, they plan to ban additional species subject to hunting and classified as near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered or extinct in the wild on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. And that, we think, will add roughly an additional 1,000 species to the import ban. Now, we believe this is going to be introduced in UK legislation as part of something called the Animal Welfare Animals Abroad Bill. We don't currently have a timetable for its introduction, as Eduardo has already mentioned, but DEFRA hopes to table the bill during the first half of 2022, as we understand it, and we're encouraging government to introduce the bill as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So I hope that's given you a little bit of insight into my concerns and those of Born Free in relation to trophy hunting. Many thanks for the opportunity, many thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have during the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating. That was a lot of information packed into a short time, so it's incredibly useful. So our next speaker is Dr. Tanya Wyatt, and Dr. Wyatt is Professor of Criminology at Northumbria University, specialising in green criminology. Her expertise centres on wildlife crime and trafficking and the abuse of non-human animals, also including organised crime, corporate crime and corruption. So thank you, Tanya. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Give me 1 second. For some reason, I cannot see my own screen share. There we go. Yes, thanks so much for the invitation today. So I'm going to be taking a bit of a different approach to my presentation. So I'm a criminologist, so I'm going to share with you what my discipline would, how we could possibly approach our thoughts around trophy hunting. So I'm going to start really basically about what is criminology, and then I'm going to actually explain how the non-human has been addressed within the discipline, and then really tie that back into trophy hunting. So historically, criminology has really been confined to just looking at what is illegal. So starting as a pretty young discipline, it's only really existed since the 1960s. And in those early years, it was only looking at what had been legally defined as criminal. So it was very, very narrow in its origins. But scholars started to challenge this, because if we're only looking at what is already illegal, then that really misses out on looking at all the other harms and injustices that are taking place and that are often invisible. And that has to do with the criminal justice system. So a lot of criminology will obviously focusing on maybe policing or prisons, but also just the wider societal issues about what gets defined as criminal. And so criminology has evolved to be something a very critical discipline that tries to explore and challenge what is actually defined as criminal or not. And within that, the non-human had for many, many decades been ignored, and it gets perhaps it starts to gain attention and focus in the 1990s with the with the advent of a green criminology, which I'll speak about in a moment. But historically, nature and the environment were only explored if it was relevant to legislation, and like I said, particularly criminal legislation. Where it starts to gain much more attention, and I think we could talk about in the context of trophy hunting, is the exploration around corporate crime, or crimes that are committed by businesses, and organized crime, which is maybe less relevant to what we're talking about today. And also then the environment starts to feature in research that demonstrates the extent of marginalization of particularly ethnic minority communities, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. So I mentioned that this changes. So in the 1990s, we have the advent of green criminology. And here's where there is a particular focus on crimes against the environment and crimes against wildlife. And it is a dedicated study to nature, or about nature. And now, since the 1990s, I'd say now, 40 years later, 30 years later, it's a very well-established subdiscipline that has hundreds of scholars around the world that are dedicated to looking at crimes against the environment. How the non-human has been addressed has evolved over that 30-year time frame. And of particular interest, and I think this actually gets to one of the questions that has just come up in the chat around links to criminality in humans. But first, I'll talk about the issue around private property. So in a vast majority of the world, certainly the Western legal systems, wildlife and animals are property. This could be private property of individuals if they own animals, and this is certainly the case with domesticated animals or so-called livestock. But we also see this in the case of wildlife, that whereas it might not be individual private property, what we would see is that wildlife are the property of the state. And this is true of a lot of countries, and definitely particular countries where trophy hunting is taking place. So since the wildlife are considered property, the state can then decide what can happen to them. And often that could be that they are allowed to be, those wildlife are allowed to be hunted. For criminologists, what's somewhat interesting about that phenomena of wildlife and animals being property is that if they are then killed, this becomes an economic crime, and often then it's treated very differently. So the suffering or loss is considered an economic term, and often it's considered legitimate too. People are allowed to do to their property what they want. So it is acceptable then in that context to hunt wildlife. I mentioned that Peter was asking in the chat about the links to animal abuse. And so there is a fairly robust literature around this issue between, so that humans are, or the prototypes of criminality in humans. So, I mean, we all hear conversation or the use of language where someone's acting like an animal, or reference to violence in humans as being linked to animals. So people are beastly or these kinds of connotations. So there are some indications that, or some research around this, that we evolve from non-human animals, so our violence is seen within them. But I think more to the point of the question, and an interesting aspect of research that needs probably more attention, is the idea that the abuse of non-human animals signifies interhuman violence. And most of this research, and Angus Nurse and I have a report out for the League Against Cruel Sports that tried to unpack this connection, is that there's what's called the progression theory, or the graduation theory, that it has been documented that if people are violent to non-human animals, this may actually progress or graduate to them committing violence against other humans. And in particular, this has been documented for domestic abuse. So there is some research indicating that people who would abuse animals in their home may well abuse their partners or other humans in their households. Then there's the perhaps exaggerated, but there is some indication that historically there are a few of the more famous serial killers who were known to, as children, to abuse animals, and then obviously go on to be incredibly violent against other humans. So there is some research out there linking animal abuse to people abusing humans. What hasn't been teased out is, does violence to animals in the form of hunting or so-called legitimate forms of activities, does this also link to violence in an interhuman capacity? So the research is focused on clear abuse, which is illegal and documented and recorded, at least sometimes, by police agencies. But what isn't teased out amongst that is legitimate forms of violence. So Peter, I think you raise a very interesting point, and an area for further research is, are people that are engaging in what many would seem as violent so-called hobbies or sports, are they then also perhaps more violent to humans as well? So I think that's an area that is an unanswered question, but one to definitely explore. And then finally, how has the non-human been addressed in criminology? The much more recent literature is that there's the suggestion or the advocacy that wildlife and non-human animals are bearers of some kind of rights or have interests. And there's a lot of scholars in green criminology that are working in that space. How are they bearers of rights? So that again is a gradation of how those rights might actually play out. Some research would show that non-human animals can still be exploited, but the limitations then need to be about the no unnecessary harm or suffering. So if we are going to be hunting, then we shouldn't be using many of the methods that Mark just talked about in terms of how that hunting is conducted. Other scholarship then is showing the right to live free of human interference. So just, and maybe this is more where proposals around 30-30 or half Earth would sit, that wildlife just have the right to live free, and that we shouldn't be thinking that we can manage them in any kind of way, and basically just let them be. And then you have perhaps the more radical kinds of approach in green criminology. So my colleague Rantam Suland at the University of Oslo probably would fit into this, about abolishing all exploitation. And you also see this outside of criminology and some critical animal studies. So Favre and others would say just abolition of exploitation, full stop. So we shouldn't have pets, we shouldn't be hunting, we shouldn't be using any sort of non-human animal products. So there's a gradation about the kinds of rights that might be awarded to non-human animals. And then part of green criminology scholarship is trying to get at this super messy interface of what about human rights and all of this. And there's often a pushback for any kind of green criminology that's advocating for animal rights, wildlife rights, about aren't human rights more important? And obviously trophy hunting gets into this messy business about claims, as Mark and Eduardo have both said, that trophy hunting is necessary because it's providing funding to conservation and livelihoods to local communities. And isn't that human right more important than the right of the different kinds of wildlife? So there's scholarship out there trying to unpack that as well. So it comes, the different scholarships really fall into what gets called the three approaches to justice. And I'll just relate these back to trophy hunting because it does get at some of these tensions that are in this conversation. So environmental justice historically has been about the differences within, or I should say between different human communities on their access to healthy and safe environments. And this research really began in the 1990s, particularly looking at US communities where it's been robustly documented that Black communities and ethnic minority communities in the US have and live in polluted areas more than white people would. So there is an environmental injustice in the access to a healthy and safe environment. And this often gets now talked about in other contexts. So this isn't just true of the US. We see this kind of environmental justice in other spaces. And often now this gets talked about in a kind of global North, global South context of, and again, Mark alluded to the colonial histories around trophy hunting of the tension or the contradiction between how Westerners are treating their environment and how other parts of the world are treating their environment, and how those unequal impacts upon the environment of the West being extractors and exploiters, perhaps more than other areas. And so this injustice between the use of natural resources and the exploitation that's being perpetrated by different people in different parts of the world. We also, in criminology, and I think this is perhaps most relevant to the trophy hunting debate, is take a species justice approach. And much of my research around wildlife trafficking has been situated in this space. And there's two levels to species justice. There is the individual well-being of a particular wildlife. And I think Mark highlighted really well the issues around animal welfare for those individual animals who are being killed. What is their experience, and are they subject to abuse, or are they suffering or harmed in some way? So there's species justice on that level, on the individual aspect. But then there's also that larger aspect of systematic exploitation of particular groups of wildlife. And we see that hunting is, thousands of years old. It's existed, of course, forever, but has that level of exploitation become systematic? And I think some of those numbers that we've seen could possibly suggest that that's true. So species justice on both levels, the individual wildlife, but also on levels of population and all the way to the level of biodiversity. And then in terms of ecological justice, this is the approach that many green criminologists take, that is advocating to preserve ecosystems or biospheres, taking a much more holistic approach to what we should be protecting. And the philosophical underpinning of that is that everything around us has intrinsic value as well. So really trying to move away from the more anthropocentric, so the human-centered approach, and that value is only given or only determined by the human species, and particularly really driven by capitalism and markets and the neoliberal frame that often we approach everything at. So taking a different approach to how a human relationship to nature and seeing us as part of that larger whole. And so if we take these different approaches to justice, it really enables us to be that critical scholar that I mentioned at the beginning, of challenging what is legally defined as crime currently, and looking at harms and suffering that aren't actually recognized by our criminal justice systems, and really exposing those and making it possible to have a conversation about those kinds of things that are what a colleague of mine calls the lawful but awful. And how that relates then in terms of trophy hunting. So I mentioned that perhaps a lot of trophy hunting is allowed or enabled by the fact that non-humans are still considered as property. And in particular, that they are commodities, or that we view wildlife as resources, that there isn't any individuality given to them. And that's certainly the case with CITES, which Eduardo and Mark have both mentioned, that CITES is a trade treaty. It is not about animal welfare. It is not about the experience of individual animals. So it talks about non-humans as being resources. And from a green criminological lens, and one of those approaches to justice, species justice or ecological justice, it allows a debate, a much more open and nuanced debate about, should that be the way that we are actually, as humans, interacting with our environment, of just treating other beings as resources. It also, criminology, I think, has the tools to get at the question that I was mentioning earlier, that got asked in the chat, around what is the link between violent sport or so-called hobbies and links to other violence. And that could be on a psychological level of people who are desensitized to violence, of being able to kill other beings. Does that enable them to be violent to other humans too, which is an important thing to explore. But in criminological terms, it also has the convergence with other crimes of access to guns, for instance, or other sorts of tools for violence. So there's a lot more to be done on exploring someone's propensity for violence. Does that play a difference if someone has been a hunter or a part of a hunting community? I mentioned around the individuality of it. So from a species justice lens or green criminological lens, really looking at the suffering of sentient beings, both individually, but both as the systematic exploitation of non-humans. And this certainly applies in the trophy hunting context, where I think the two colleagues who've spoken before me have documented very well about the level of consistent amounts of death of wildlife over the decades that the commercial trophy hunting has really taken off. And then in particular, the value of looking at trophy hunting or other things like it from a criminological lens is this harm versus crime. Trophy hunting is legal, but what are the harms that are allowed that we should be looking at and that we should be questioning? And I think obviously the animal welfare issue is a big part of that. Criminology also has the tools to talk about the human versus the non-humans. And it, as I mentioned, it's such a messy debate because of supporters of trophy hunting seeing that it has a conservation value and seeing that it supports people and livelihoods, and pitting that against individual non-humans. And so that is a debate that needs to continue and based on good evidence and information. And then this idea of the individual versus the collective of even if it is true that sacrificing one life of a lion and that money goes to all of these different, if that money were to stay in the local community and have value, is that individual life versus the collective, is that a trade-off that should be happening? And that gets at those moral and ethical questions that Eduardo talked about at the very beginning of the session today. So we're trying to criminologists are trying to push the boundaries on all of these conversations in the context of trophy hunting. And I would say too, and I should have included it on the slide here, is I think that what we also, and certainly my research has looked at this into wildlife trafficking, is that blending of legal and illegal. And Monica had asked in the chat as well about, do we know how much illegal trophies are coming into the UK? And I don't think we probably have a good sense of that. And that's the challenge for law enforcement and for scholars like myself looking at this issue, is that when you have a legal market, does that enable a black market and an illegal market to exist alongside that? And because there are legitimate businesses who have, who are operating in a legal space, it becomes very sticky as to whether you can find information about illegal activity. So that's a real challenge for scholars and for law enforcement in this space, because the legal infrastructure could provide, and I'm not saying that it does because I don't think that we know for sure. I think there's very limited data about trophy hunting using their legal infrastructure to engage in illegal activity. We do see that in other spaces around, for instance, around pet breeding. We know that there's laundering that goes on there, saying something's wild, saying something's captive when it's actually been wild caught. So using that infrastructure, that legal infrastructure, to engage in illegal activity. And I think that's something to look out for if the trophy hunting ban does come in to existence in the UK, is how do you then adapt to there still being a legal infrastructure, but the demand still being there, and what do we do to actually then find all of that illegal activity? And that, like I said, is certainly a challenge for law enforcement, but for scholars as well. I have finished a bit early there, but hopefully that will just mean time for more questions. I will stop sharing that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Tanya. That was really interesting because it gives us a perspective that we don't often hear about with trophy hunting. There was a lot of information there that I haven't heard before, especially wildlife being the property of the state. I find there's so much that was just completely fascinating. So our next speaker is Professor Geoff Beattie from Edge Hill University. He is Professor of Psychology at Edge Hill, and his research focuses on embodied cognition and multimodal communication and applied social psychology. He was previously Professor of Psychology at the University of Manchester. He has published 26 books and over 100 academic articles in prestigious journals, and he is a Fellow of the British Psychological Society, the Royal Society of Medicine, and the Royal Society of Arts. So thank you, Geoff, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me hope that this all works. Right. Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you first of all for inviting me. What I'm going to try and do is summarize what we know about the psychology of trophy hunting. Tanya's talk was very interesting because she flagged up some of the gaps, and I'll also be flagging up some of the gaps, but hopefully I'll have something to say about the broad thing. I think people started thinking more about the psychology of trophy hunting with Cecil the lion for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, they had an animal with a name that they felt that they could get to know a bit. I think the fact that the person who killed it was a dentist kind of got people interested. And I think the whole a series of actions around it, about the obvious cruelty of it, the longevity of it, what was done to it, and that it was a well-known creature in that park. It just seemed, to many people who might not have been that interested in trophy hunting before, just extraordinary what had happened. And I remember at the time people kept asking me about the psychology of people who could do this, and I thought, there's always going to be a kind of interesting bit of psychology behind it. Now, I think if we're serious about trying to think about the psychology behind it, we could take a number of different approaches to the topic. And when I started looking into this, I thought this is a really broad issue because it's about group psychology. We have two groups, trophy hunters and everyone else. And we have to think about how groups operate and how they sustain a culture and how they neutralize emotions and so on. So we have to think about that. We have to think about evolution and evolutionary arguments, and because they're never far from the kind of mind of some people when they're trying to defend it. They're saying, well, look, trophy hunting is just a kind of obvious evolutionary continuation of what we've always done. It's natural. You know, we hunted to provide food for our families and children. We still hunt. So I thought if we're serious about the psychology, we have to look at that. Then we have to look at psychological motivations. Now, as a psychologist, I can tell you that's not necessarily easy. You know, you can look at what people say, and there's been some work done on what people say, and I'll talk about that work. But as a psychologist who's looked into many different applied topics, I think that motivations are a bit more complicated than that. And I'll be hinting about that and ways of approaching it. And then, of course, you might want to look at the language and discourse of trophy hunting, irrespective of probing motivations, because human beings use language for a very good reason. We give meaning to our lives and our actions through language, and of course therefore we have to understand how trophy hunters and others give meaning to their lives through language. But as was just said, I also work on multimodal communication. A big part of communication is non-verbal. I've done a lot of work on gesture and facial expression and something else. And again, it seems to me when it comes to trophy hunting, the non-verbal communication, the representation of the animal with the hunter is a kind of critical bit of the whole story. So again, I'll be talking about that. And finally, I'll get on to the personality of the trophy hunter, because when I talk about all the rest, it's obviously that some people are drawn to it and some people aren't drawn to it. And I want to talk about what we know about those psychological characteristics. So first of all, in terms of groups, well, it's quite clearly there are two kind of, sorry, I use an expression like this, but two tribes here. There's one tribe who are trophy hunters, and then there's all the rest of us. And the two tribes have got interesting and significant views of the other one. So cold, those who don't hunt see these people as cold-blooded psychopathological killers, and the trophy hunters themselves have strong views about the people who don't hunt. Weak-willed liberals who wouldn't have the strength, courage, or attributes to do what they do, and ignorant as well. And interesting quotes from Theodore Roosevelt, who of course was a very keen hunter, who said, in a civilized and cultivated society, wild animals only continue to exist at all when preserved by sportsmen. The excellent people who protest against all hunting and consider sportsmen as enemies of wildlife are ignorant of the fact that in reality, the genuine sportsman is by all odds the most important factor in keeping the larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination. And obviously Marx kind of addressed that point in his talk, but nevertheless, you hear something about the way they think. Now, there's a well-known phenomenon in psychology called the false consensus effect, which is we see our own behavior as being kind of appropriate and relevant and suited to a situation. And people who differ from ourselves, we're more likely to make not just explanations of their behavior, attributions about their behavior, but more likely to make dispositional attributions. We're more likely to think it tells us something about them. And of course, what we see with trophy hunting is that people who don't hunt make very strong dispositional attributions. Hunters, they make something similar about the rest of us. So we need to bear that in mind. But the whole point about this false consensus effect, of course, with trophy hunting, it's emphasized and exaggerated and cultivated by this culture of trophy hunting, which I had a brief look into. This whole culture of magazines, websites, blogs, and events like the Safari Club International. It's been mentioned a few times by a number of speakers. Here's just a quote from Safari Club International. "We test ourselves against nature. We get to know ourselves. We love these animals that we kill in this epic battle. We love these animals." And this whole business of loving animals comes up again and again and again. I'll say a little bit about that. Safari Club International, here's just an image from a meeting. here's another image, and here's another image. And of course, people who hunt see nothing wrong with bringing the family along. This is part of the culture, nothing to be ashamed of, and something to be shared, and a joy there. And of course, the thing that I suppose surprises and shocks many people who don't hunt are these images of the hunter with a dead animal, and the smiles that you see, and the way the animals are used as props. And I want to talk about the psychology of that. Now, the first thing I want to say, though, is to say something about evolution, because it comes up all the time when you look at trophy hunters talking about what they do. And the argument is that hunting large prey is a natural way of securing sufficient food for the family. But the problem with the evolutionary argument is that it's recognized both in evolutionary terms and anthropological terms, that it just generates too much food for any for the immediate family. And people have talked about reciprocal sharing and so on, which again doesn't seem to work when you generate that much. And from a kind of pretty early stage, we've kind of recognized that it's not necessarily about providing food, it's about something else. It's about what's called costly signaling. And costly signaling is it's about using conspicuous display as a form of communication that signals inclusive fitness. So hunting large prey was always about signaling something about the individuals concerned. And the reason inclusive fitness is important is it's a way of doing well in the genetic game. It kind of draws attention to yourself. People who are high in inclusive fitness mate more and have more children, etc., etc., etc. So the kind of starting point from the evolutionary argument is to think about costly signaling. So there's something about the signaling functioning of large prey. And of course, the point about costly signaling, it has to come at a cost. Then, in evolutionary terms, in evolutionary theory, it's assumed that it takes a considerable amount of courage, skill, or cunning to work in this respect. Now, the problem with trophy hunting, of course, is that you don't necessarily have to have those attributes to succeed in it. So in trophy hunting terms, the dead animal is not necessarily a sign of courage, skill, or cunning. But of course, these can be worked up in the discourse. And it seems to me that's a really important aspect of trying to analyze the discourse of trophy hunting, how inclusive fitness is in some sense generated in the talk. It's more a sign of material wealth. Mark talked at length about how much all of this costs. The figures are staggering. And Veblen, the sociologist, applied this, of course, to economic matters when he talked about conspicuous consumption. So it's almost a sign of conspicuous consumption rather than anything else. So when you think about the evolutionary argument, it leaves many questions unanswered, including why only some men go for it, and why we see female trophy hunters, which is a really interesting problem from an evolutionary point of view, because anthropologically, women, generally speaking, hunt for much smaller creatures rather than men. So evolution's kind of worked up in the discourse of trophy hunters, but when you look at it anthropologically or in evolutionary terms, we have to think about inclusive fitness, and then we see this kind of shift from inclusive fitness to something else. Now, in terms of psychological motivation, this for a lot of people they see as being the kind of core issue. The reason I'm reading from this thing rather than from the slides is that for some reason everyone's faces are covering my slide, so I can't really read it off the slide. I obviously have to do something to those images, but I can't do it. So I'll read from this. So in terms of psychological motivation, this is a quote from John Steinbeck, which I like. We've never understood why men mount the heads of animals and hang them up to look down on their conquerors. Possibly it feels good to these men to be superior to animals, but it does seem that if they were sure of it, they would not have to prove it. Often a man who is afraid must constantly demonstrate their courage, and in the case of the hunter, must keep a tangible record of his courage. For ourselves, we have mounted in a small hardwood plaque, one perfect Borrego dropping, and where another man can say, there was an animal, but because I am greater than he is dead and I am alive, and there is his head to prove it, we can say, there was an animal, and for all we know, there still is, and here is proof of it. It's very healthy when we last heard of him. It kind of witty kind of responds to this notion of what it is about trophies that are psychologically so appealing? You know, what is it they're trying to prove? Well, there's been a number of attempts to try to understand the psychological motivations behind trophy hunting. And this was one published study which was published in 2017, which analyzed 455 hunting stories from online hunting forums and coded 2,864 individual phrases. So it looked at the stories and it tried to code phrases in order to identify what the core motivations behind hunting was. And I would describe this as a kind of bottom-up rather than a top-down approach. I mean, it's taking individual phrases and the building blocks of language and meaning, and trying to see what they're about. And they use this kind of coding, which is they look for three kind of attributes, which is achievement, affiliation, and appreciation. So achievements is what they accomplished by doing it. Affiliation is kind of linking with other hunters, and appreciation is appreciating the beauty of the animal and the beauty of nature. So they did things like this, was really pleased with this buck. They coded that, interestingly, as an achievement motivation. It's kind of mildly ambiguous from my point of view. Very grateful for all the help from good friends, affiliation, you know, praising the friends. Harvest, you know, when they talk about harvest, they see that as an achievement motivation. And this beautiful animal, every time they talk about the beauty of the animal, they see that as being appreciation. So when they coded these several thousand phrases, they found that achievement was the most frequent satisfaction. 81% of the ungulate and 86% of the carnivore stories were about achievement. And they conclude that these analyses could offer significant insight into wildlife management. Designing regulations that focus on achievement satisfactions would be particularly successful. Now, I think from a psychology point of view, I find this a bit unsatisfying, really, because it doesn't give me a feel for what they're doing in these stories. I would describe it as trying to understand the structure of a building by looking at the bricks. It's looking at the building blocks, but not the overall thing. And I thought this didn't really give me any real insight into the psychological motivations behind trophy hunting, or how people use language to give it meaning and to portray themselves in the whole thing. So I thought that was it's a well-cited reference, but in my view, not particularly psychologically illuminating. So I wanted to kind of probe this a little bit more. So again, just to start with a quote from Ellen DeGeneres: "I ask people why they have deer heads on the wall. They always say because it's such a beautiful animal." There you go. I think my mother is attractive, but I have photographs of her. So again, just a quote to get us warmed up. One thing you can look at, and the reason I start with this is that I've looked at a whole, I've done some work into a whole series of other types of what I would call kind of antisocial and unlawful activities of people who engage in various things, and always been interested in the way they build their narratives. And the way they build their narratives kind of almost subconsciously is that there are justifications built throughout them. We kind of seem to do it kind of instinctively without much necessarily planning, but it seems to work. If you ask people consciously about their justifications, they get a bit reluctant to mention it. So this is Kendall Jones when she was interviewed, asked about justification. She says, "I have a hard time with the word justify because it implies that I'm doing something wrong. I have to make excuses for my action." Excuses are something quite different, of course. This is Kendall here, a well-known trophy hunter and a kind of pin-up of Safari International. But nevertheless, justifications are interesting because when I've done work on violent men for a book I did, or for terrorists, in terms of how they build constructions of themselves and their actions, you find these kind of complex things, but in those complex things, you can often see types of justifications which are put into them, not when you're saying, can you justify what you do? They just do it when they give you the story of their actions. And what's interesting when you look at justifications is that two sociologists called Scott and Lyman did an analysis of subtypes of justification quite a number of years ago, and said, look, there are a number of features these things tend to have, which is things like this: denial of injury, which is denies the victim was seriously injured. And I've got some great interviews with bouncers talking about when they engage in violence and the way they describe how the victims have are, and of course this denial of injury is very, very common. Even when someone's unconscious on the floor, they just say he's gone to sleep for a few minutes. Of course, when it comes to trophy hunting, you don't get denial of injury because they've killed the animal. Denial of the victim is interesting because that seems to be a common feature in trophy hunting, where the victim somehow deserved what was coming to them. And then, of course, you get condemnation of the condemners. The action's insignificant in comparison with how others behave. And that's kind of, again, common in trophy hunting. And appeal to loyalties. Behavior is acceptable as it's in the interest of the group. And I think that business of the loyalties thing is very interesting. How they condemn those who condemn them, and this notion of how they build constructions of the animals that they kill. So a number of things like this. So, for example, denial of the victim. The specific animal deserved it in some way. It's a rogue animal, it's aggressive, it's terrorizing the neighborhood. So Kendall, again talking, they only permit the hunting of 5 rhinos a year. Normally these creatures are rhinos that are old and no longer at the this print's so small I can hardly read it, and no longer able to reproduce, sick or too dangerous to coexist with the other rhinos. So again, it's kind of denial of the victim. Condemn the condemners. They don't manage the animals properly. A cull is necessary. Doing a cull, I've had to travel all this way to help you guys out. So they're condemning the condemners. She's going the extra mile to kill these animals to help people. And appeal to loyalties to like-minded individuals who share their values of rugged individualism and independent thought. Now, the reason justifications are interesting is they provide a structure for narratives and stories. I've done a lot of work in psychology on analyzing discourse and stories people tell. I'm really interested in the way that we give meaning to our lives through these stories. But when it comes to trophy hunting, one recurrent feature, not when you ask them in an interview, but just when you hear them, is looking for these type of justifications. They emerge freely as we talk about what we've experienced and what we've done. And of course, we're all creatures of language. And I like to talk about the transformational power of language, and language allows us to transform any situation, and we have to be aware of that. Now, I'm interested in how people communicate and interact, but I'm also interested in how we give meaning to the things that we do. Language is for other people, but it's also for ourselves as well. It gives meaning privately to our own lives. And I think those two processes are intimately connected. There's a big area of psychology which just looks at language in interaction, but the way that we give meaning to things that we do, and then how that shapes how we behave, is to me is a really interesting feature. And again, I think that's particularly interesting in this area. But of course, when it comes to trying to understand trophy hunting, I think we can look at the language, we can look at how they give meaning, we can look at their justification techniques. But I think as soon as you start having any glimpse into the lives of trophy hunters, there's something else which becomes immediately apparent, and we're going to have to kind of look at and consider, which is kind of moving beyond language and looking at the non-verbal communication of hunters, because I think that's the thing that chills most people who are not hunters, which is how they represent what they've done with apparently enormous pride and enormous enjoyment. And a lot of work's been done on the smiles of trophy hunters. And the point about these smiles is that there are a number of different smiles that people use in everyday life. There are natural, spontaneous smiles, or smiles of genuine enjoyment, which are called Duchamp smiles, after the French physiologist who first described them. And of course, there are other types of smiles which are called masking smiles. And Duchamp smiles involve the muscles around the eyes and around the mouth. And the point about Duchamp smiles, although you can't see it from still images, of course, is they go onto the face slowly and fade slowly. Non-Duchamp smiles go on very quickly and fade very quickly. As I'm sure you're all aware, politicians use non-Duchamp smiles all the time, but trophy hunters seem to use these other types, which is really interesting and really chilling. So Duchamp smiles have been scored in trophy hunting images. They're significantly more likely when hunters are photographed with prey than without it, and significantly more likely when the hunters pose with large prey compared with small prey. So it's telling us something about the deep-seated psychological satisfaction they get from that. Interestingly and worryingly, older hunters show more Duchamp smiles than younger hunters, so it's not something that fades with age. And when posing with carnivores rather than herbivores, older hunters are significantly more likely to show facial smiles. So it tells us something about this kind of deep-seated psychological satisfaction they kind of get from this killing. And of course, you don't have to look too far to see kind of images of this kind of thing. So it's not just what they say in their language, their body language seems to also be supporting this. Now, that's one aspect of these smiles, but of course, smiles are also quite kind of complicated because in these representation, because these are the representation that trophy hunters use for each other. They use for when they look back on what they've done. And again, I think they have a more complex function here. They're not always, of course, necessarily natural signs of achievement. Some people can, in a still image, can of course generate something like a traditional smile pretty easily. And you could say that what we've got in the images are hyper ritualized displays, and of course, which they're specially selecting. In other words, like any social media post, you pick which one you want to post, which demonstrates something. And of course, what they're demonstrating is this kind of connection between them and these incredible animals. So it's something about power and privilege and entitlement without moral certainty. This kind of image here, where they're using the animal as a prop. Is it about achievement, or is it something more than that? Is it something about the status of this guy who I don't know who he is, vis-a-vis the animal? Does it tell us something about that? Because if it is, then that might take us down a particular psychological route. What kind of person needs to do this to feel good about himself? That, to me, is the interesting issue. It's not just about achievement. I mean, achievement's undoubtedly some aspect of it, but I would say that the non-verbal communication doesn't just tell us about achievement. It tells us about this extra thing as well, which I've become very interested in. These images, I would say, are interactional. They influence other people and ourselves by changing our memory for events. We know about human memory that it's not like a video loop, it's constructive. And one thing we use in the constructive aspects of human memory is images from the past. So we look back on our hunt and we see the images, and they help us construct what it was all like. We're smiling, it was incredibly enjoyable. And we use them to fill in the details of the hunt with admiration and awe. And I think that is an interesting aspect of the whole thing. Again, I was going to say very little work, no research on this, how trophy hunters reconstruct what the hunt was like on the back of the images they use. But we know generally that images like this influence memory. Now, the question is, if it is about kind of power and dominance and entitlement and so on in these images, what is it about people who are attracted to it? Now, again, I think the psychology here is potentially interesting and illuminating. Now, there's a number of types of personality dimensions that I think are relevant here, and I think it also bears on some of the stuff that Tanya was mentioning in her talk. But I just want to mention 3 personality types, which I think are potentially important here. Narcissism, first of all, normally defined as an inflated, grandiose self-concept and a lack of intimacy in interpersonal relationships. Narcissists are thought to suffer from extreme selfishness with a grandiose view of their own talents. Now, that's narcissism, not necessarily a very positive characteristic, but of course it has implications for all of us. And the next proposition is the interesting one. So if you see yourself as superior to others, if that's your self-concept, but are not actually superior on more objective indicators, then how do you maintain this inflated level of self-esteem? Well, to do that, you need to engage in a variety of strategies to maintain and develop your self-image. Now, of course, social media is a godsend for people who suffer from narcissism, because it's a way of maintaining your perception of yourself by endless posts which portray yourself in particular kinds of ways. And I think if we're going to understand trophy hunting, we have to think about this personality dimension. You measure narcissism in the following kind of way. So it's a simple questionnaire. I prefer to blend in with the crowd. I like to be the center of attention. You have to have a guess which one the narcissists say. I can live my life any way I want to. people can't always live their lives in terms of what they want to do. Obviously, the narcissists like to be the center of attention. They feel entitled. They can live their life any way they want to. And much like everybody else, is not a narcissist. I'm an extraordinary person. Is a narcissist. So that kind of grandiose self-concept, entitlement, attention, I would say are pretty critical to understanding trophy hunting. What's interesting about narcissism, it seems to be on the increase. Some psychologists have written about the narcissism epidemic in terms of behavior, in terms of discourse, in terms of cultural practice. People's self-ratings of their abilities seem to be going up year on year. People endlessly present themselves on social media. And if you ask young kids, what's the best thing in the world? Certainly in the US, the UK, and many other countries, the most popular answer is being a celebrity. Now, the contributing factors to this, well, changes in parenting practice. Children were once warned about being perceived as a show-off. Culture has changed in terms of reality television. Technology has changed in terms of social media, the digital age, and of course, we're living in the age of celebrity, where you can see celebrities as super spreaders of this. Now, the point about trophy hunting and narcissism is that narcissists are masters at staying in the spotlight. They love attention and will do almost anything to get it. So you can see that trophy hunting kind of feeds into this pretty well. The display of dead lions at the feet of the hunter can be construed as a part of a narcissistic strategy to elevate social status and maintain an inflated concept of self-esteem. Critical to this, I would say, is the postural arrangement of the hunter with respect to the dead animals, especially the big five, which includes the king of the jungle. It's not called the king or nothing. What does that make me, buddy? So it's this iconic and unconsciously understood sign of an elevated status vis-a-vis the animals themselves. And it seems to me that's kind of critical to understand trophy hunting. It's this kind of narcissistic display. It's the display of these people with respect to the animal to try to elevate their status. That's why you get these very odd kind of images of the people with the animals, et cetera, et cetera. There's a couple seem to be, well, you see it for yourself. No, so I became very interested because I'm interested in non-verbal communication. I'm interested in representation, and it seems to me that you can look at trophy hunting images in that kind of way. What was also interesting when I started looking at interviews with trophy hunters, it's not confined to the non-verbal representation. It pops up in their language as well, and that, in other words, if you're interested in multimodal communication, it seems to be represented in several modalities. Sequentially and sometimes simultaneously. So here's Kendall Jones talking again. Yes, I am a hunter, but I'm a conservationist first and foremost. People like to jump to conclusions, and most of the time it isn't their fault. Most people don't understand that hunting is and always will be a useful tool for conservation. So what's she doing there? She's saying, well, I'm not just a hunter, I'm a conservationist, built elevating her status. People jump to conclusions. So in other words, people like you, or I assume your views, which is it's a really bad thing. It's not your fault, So she's elevating her status vis-a-vis her critics, and you don't get it. You just don't understand it. So again, it's that narcissistic strategy. Look, I'm a special person. Emphasized by this: hunting isn't a sport for everyone, and I acknowledge that. Hunting is no easy feat. So in other words, you wouldn't be able to do it. Again, narcissistic. I'm a special person. I'm telling you about what I do. Slightly oddly, I'm a huge fan of The Walking Dead. If that ever happened in real life, I'd feel confident in my abilities to survive. Well, that's just an odd one from my point of view. But again, this is how special she is. It's inflated to the realm of fantasy without a second thought. So narcissism is certainly a major aspect of trophy hunting. It has to be viewed as such. It has to be viewed in terms of this. People with either a weak self-esteem or a self-esteem that needs inflating in some way, and they're using these animals and the portrayal of the animals as a way of elevating their status. But I think narcissism is important, but I think there's other things important as well with respect to this. And the two other things, three in all, including narcissism, the other two things I'd like to mention is Machiavellianism people who will do whatever they have to manipulate social situations. And psychopathy, the dimension, and it's a dimension which is potentially interesting because psychopaths tend to be pretty callous individuals who lack empathy, and I think that's also pretty critical. These three measures, of course, correlate. They're all connected because psychopaths have also got an inflated concept of self and create positive attention, and a number of psychologists, including Kavanagh, correlate them and come up with a composite score called a measure of the dark triad. They're not positive attributes. How you test for Machiavellianism is questions like this. All in all, it's better to be humble and honest than to be important and dishonest. If I'd say yes to that, you're not a Machiavellian. It's hard to get ahead without cutting corners. You are, etc., etc. It's wise to flatter important people. Machiavellian, blah blah blah, etc., etc. You can see. I'm sure you can do this in your own time and see how whether you're high on that Machiavellianism score. Psychopathy is interesting. There is something called the psychopathy checklist, which has got good reliability and good predictability. And psychopathy seems to be composed as a form of personality, which is characterized by a number of different traits. Factor one is kind of interpersonal, affective, or emotional traits, and factor two is about the behavioral aspects of psychopathy. So all you do is you go through this checklist, which has got 20 items. Again, you can try this at home. If it doesn't apply, you give yourself a 0 for it. If it applies somewhat, you give yourself 1. If it applies definitely, you give yourself 2. So you can end up with a score between 0 and 40. The cutoff's about 30, and that is pretty high on this dimension. Represents the prototypical psychopath. So the dimensions are things like this: glibness or superficial charm, and what the number indicates afterwards is the dimension it applies to. So one refers to factor one, the interpersonal affective. So psychopaths tend to have superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth, of course, kind of connected to narcissism, need for stimulation, prone to boredom. So again, you see how that kind of feed into trophy hunting, pathological lying. They kind of enjoy portraying things which are not true, conning and manipulative, lack of remorse or guilt. Again, this kind of lack of remorse, lack of empathy would be critical to trophy hunting. Shallow affect, they just don't get the same emotional response that other people or other things, suffering in the way that the rest of us do, so that could feed into it. Callous lack of sympathy, again, you see how that could be connected to trophy hunting. Parasitic lifestyle is it's not necessarily directly applicable. Poor behavioral controls, can't inhibit themselves in the normal way. Promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavioral problems. Now that's interesting because again, Tanya mentioned early issues to do with animal cruelty as being an indicator. It's considered a red flag for psychopathy, in fact. But not necessarily for trophy hunting. I'll mention that in a second, but that's interesting. Lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, and irresponsibility. So a whole series of kind of factors there. Failure to accept responsibility, many short-term marital problems, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release means you just do a whole series of bad things, and criminal versatility. And they're basically, that's the psychopathy checklist. And the higher the score, the more prone you are to psychopathy, but it's characterized by a lack of empathy, callousness, and of course it's got that narcissistic dimension as well. Now, in terms of what the research tells us, Kavanagh did some work which suggested that less positive attitudes towards animals were associated with higher levels of narcissism, higher levels of Machiavellianism, and higher levels of psychopathy. So less positive attitudes generally is correlated with all three. In addition, the composite dark triad score was also correlated with attitudes to animals. They also found that higher levels of psychopathy were associated with actual behavior and not just attitudinal measures, having intentionally killed a stray or wild animal for no good reason, and having intentionally hurt or tortured an animal for the purpose of teasing it or causing pain. So there's a lot of research to suggest that those personality measures do predict a certain attitude to animals, and in one case predict actual behavior with animals. Now, the big thing, and again, Tanya mentioned this, does it apply to trophy hunting? Does it apply to sanctioned cruelty? And the answer is we don't know. The research hasn't been done. And when I started looking into this, I suppose I was quite surprised that no one had directly tried to test this. So whether the results of the Cabana work has direct implications for the personality of trophy hunters depends on how you view trophy hunting. If you assume that you need a less positive attitude towards certain species of animals and assume that trophy hunting is a sanctioned act of animal cruelty, then it might be reasonable to infer that these results are directly relevant to trophy hunters. So in other words, if you think that animal cruelty is part of it and you need a less negative attitude, and if you think that callousness and lack of empathy are kind of critical dimensions here, then it's likely to be the case that they are directly connected. So a lack of empathy and a degree of callousness may well facilitate trophy hunting and may even be necessary conditions for it. Trophy hunting and its depiction in images and films may well facilitate the maintenance of narcissistic flow. So in other words, those images are undoubtedly connected to this narcissistic dimension. And this combination of personality characteristics may indeed be lethal, and certainly so for the animals concerned. So my hypothesis would be that narcissism and psychopathy in combination seem to be a kind of unique, kind of combination of personality factors which are likely to be associated with this. But of course, as usual, we need more direct research on that. So to understand trophy hunting from a psychology point of view, we need to consider costly signaling theory and what it signals about wealth and other attributes. I think that's one aspect of the whole thing. Hunting stories and how achievement is built within them, even when the battle is completely one-sided. Again, people have talked about canned hunting and what's going on there. Again, we need research on that. How these hunting stories are built up, how trophy hunters give meaning at this kind of higher end level. Not in terms of phrase, not in terms of the kind of work that's been done so far. I think that's very limited. We need to kind of analyze these stories more and more carefully. What I call here the ready calculus of justifications and how justifications are built and so readily deployed. We need to understand the types of justifications they use. I've had one look at it. We need a lot more research on that field. We need more research into both the public language of trophy hunters and how that feeds into their understanding of what they've done. The whole business of these trophy hunting posts, people find them, as do I, incredibly objectionable, incredibly shocking. But it's interesting, how they're used by the trophy hunters themselves in terms of their memory and the reconstruction of the events. It seems to me that's another avenue for a lot more research. And the darker personality profiles, I think we definitely need some kind of direct work on that. Everything's kind of stacking up towards that as being a major predictive factor, but we certainly need more work on that. So in summary, psychology, in my view, may well hold the key to understanding trophy hunting, while it continues, indeed while it flourishes in this narcissistic age of ours. And ultimately, what can be done to combat it? If you want to combat something, of course, you can just make it illegal, but it may just go underground. How can we deconstruct it and understand it? And in some sense, make them aware of what it's about. Who would want to be told that this is just a form of narcissistic display for people with low self-esteem? And that the deconstruction of their heroic trophy battles exposes the reality behind it. So I think I think there is a kind of academic discourse which has a role to play in defeating it, really. And human beings are capable of self-reflection and can develop insight into their own actions, and sometimes that may be enough to provide some degree of change. But it depends on other factors, of course, that we need to identify and analyze and deconstruct the rules of behavior in place in the first place. This process of identification analysis at multiple levels has only just begun. And I would say that it's not just an interesting area, it's an area of enormous concern. And I think we need to understand a little bit more about the psychology of the whole thing. And I'd like to thank the Born Free Foundation for their encouragement and support to do this work. And I did a book published in 2020 on this called trophy hunting in a psychological perspective. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. That was brilliant. That was a brilliant summation of a really complex topic in a short amount of time. So it's completely fascinating. So now we're going to move on to a panel discussion and bring in all the speakers. So I'll put the speakers, and this is really for everyone to answer. So for all the speakers, just you know, chime in with your thoughts, and we'll have a discussion between us. So the first question is, do we have information about illegal hunting arriving in the UK, presuming that both legal and illegal hunting represents a large economic source of income for some countries where hunting takes place?
Shall I maybe kick off on that one, because I posted a brief response. I mean, there's two questions there. In terms of illegal trophy hunting imports, the only data we have, of course, is from the CITES trade database, and that's where it tells us that they have made confiscations. Now, the numbers are very small. Just looking back to 2000, to the year 2000. Since then, there've been about half a dozen confiscations. So trophies of leopards and lequi, and I think the other animals that I list there. And of course, one of the difficulties is, you know, how do you distinguish a legal or an illegal trophy? And in fact, this is one of the points that you made to the government recently when they were talking initially about a much more restrictive ban on hunting trophies. So they were looking at you know, just the most endangered species. And one of the questions we put to them, well, okay, so let's say, for example, the Hartmann zebra is included, but the Burchell zebra isn't, which basically was their proposal at the time. I said, well, how are you going to get a customs official, a border official, or whoever to be able to distinguish between the skin of one and the other? You know, what's the difference between a spotted hyena and a striped hyena? You know, one would be included, one wouldn't be. But, you know, is it more right or more wrong to kill one than the other when, you know, one of them's got 10,000 in the wild, the other's got 20,000? Surely this is a moral issue, as well as, you know, just in terms of the enforcement. It's just going to be much easier to have a comprehensive ban. I mean, in terms of the value of trophy hunting to the economy and to the economy of Africa, I mean, the data suggests that the total annual value of that trophy hunting industry is somewhere in the region of 200 million. Now, how many jobs does it provide? About 15,000. Which isn't a lot. And when you compare the 200 million revenue to, for example, the amount that nature tourism generates, and there's varying figures from between 50 billion and upwards that I've heard as well. If we look just at the example of Kenya, which is a country that banned all trophy hunting in 1977, so the annual value of their nature tourism, photographic tourism, ecotourism, etc., that's about $1 billion a year. So 5 times as much as the entire trophy hunting industry throughout the whole of Africa. And it isn't just Africa that this applies to. If you look, for example, at Canada, where you have polar bear trophy hunting, so the amount of revenue that is generated by the trophy hunting industry there is minuscule. So, for example, there is one town called Churchill where people come, you know, to see polar bears, and they can, you know, take photos of them. And that one town alone receives more in revenues from polar bear nature tourism than the entire polar bear trophy hunting industry. Similarly, there's a company that does sea viewing photography holidays where you can go to sea and see the polar bears at sea. That ship, that company, again, generates more than the trophy hunting industry. So there's 2 issues there. One is about illegal trophy imports and confiscations. There are a few, but there's not very many, and a lot of it is simply about the problems with enforcement and the selectivity of policy, I think. And in terms of the value of the trophy hunting industry, you know, the example of Tanzania is another one. I mean, the hunting estates, trophy hunting estates occupy 26% of Tanzania's landmass, and yet they generate something like 0.22% to the country's GDP. Very few jobs, very little in terms of local benefits.
Hi, Sarah. Can I maybe chip in there as well? I agree with everything that Eduardo has been saying. I mean, the other issue with legality is that, Eduardo's talked about the difficulties that, that enforcement authorities may face in determining whether a particular trophy belongs to one species or one subspecies or another subspecies, which may or may not affect the legality. The other thing is, of course, that in spite of the fact that for many, not all of the protected species that are trophy hunted and that might arrive at our borders, the UK does require the issuing of an import permit before that trophy is allowed to come in, if they're CITES listed. It doesn't cover all species, all CITES listed species, and that's a bone of contention in itself. And in order to provide that import permit, the UK authorities have a duty to determine that the trophy has been legally acquired, and that the requirement for non-detriment, in other words, that the trophy has been acquired in a way which doesn't damage the population of animals from which, the animal from which the trophy has been derived has been killed, has been satisfied. But in spite of that requirement, in most cases, authorities will sort of rely on the fact that the exporting country has issued an export permit in order to sort of guarantee the legality of the hunt. But of course, as we know, the issuing of an export permit by an exporting country doesn't necessarily guarantee that the trophy was legally acquired, or that all the requirements for legal acquisition have been followed. And, for example, there were lots and lots of questions. I know these trophies didn't come into the UK, but there were lots and lots of questions about very high profile hunts, like the hunting of lions in Zimbabwe, Cecil the lion and Mopane the lion, that suggested that those lions had been lured out of a protected area in order to lure them into a hunting area where they could be targeted by hunters, because they were considered to be such magnificent trophy animals. And that process in itself was probably illegal under Zimbabwean law, which suggests that those trophies may well not have been legally acquired according to the law. But nevertheless, Zimbabwe issued an export permit, and presumably the US authorities accepted that as proof of legal acquisition. So it's a complicated, really complicated question. And in terms of the money generated by trophy hunting, I mean, Eduardo has outlined, it sounds like a lot of money when you talk about $200 or $300 million across sub-Saharan Africa, or whatever the figure might be. It's a tiny amount in terms of GDP of those countries, in terms of income from other potential sources. And you have to question where that money goes. Does all that money end up with local communities? Does all that money end up, or a significant proportion end up with wildlife authorities in order to enable them to protect animals or protect areas? No, of course it doesn't. The vast majority of that money, in most cases, will end up within the trophy hunting industry and all the various actors that support it. So a lot of questions and issues around there. Of course, we have to look at how trophy hunting does generate money. People pay quite a lot of money sometimes on an individual basis to hunt animals, tens of thousands. In the case of likes of black rhino, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for trophy permits. But, and we have to look at how we fund biodiversity protection and how we fund local community development on a sort of global basis in order to ensure that we can do that effectively. But we have to move away from this paradigm where, where the only way that seemed to do this is to allow wealthy, largely Western people to travel around the world paying to shoot threatened animals.
Could I just add one additional point, which is that one of the many problems with trophy hunting is that it provides a loophole through which illegal wildlife trafficking can take place. So, for example, a rhino horn valued at hundreds of millions of dollars have been legally acquired by wildlife traffickers using the CITES permit system. This is well reported, well documented. So literally there'd be these wildlife traffickers who would put Vietnamese peasants and prostitutes on planes and get them to pretend to be a trophy hunter. So they would shoot the rhino, they would pose for the photo, and they would claim to be a trophy hunter, and they would take, the rhino horn, and that would then enter the black market. And it was an enormous scam. And now, in fact, if you look at who are the big rhino hunters, the leading nation for rhino trophy hunting at the moment is China. And so, more than a third of all the rhino horns and other rhino body parts that are coming out of Africa are going into China, but legally. But we know that a large number of them are ending up in the traditional Chinese market trade. And the same happens with a number of different species. Another example would be, well, bears and bear galls and gall bladders. I mean, there's been, if you look at the CITES trade database, enormous numbers of bear galls have been ending up in Hong Kong and China, supposedly as hunting trophies. And we know that the Russian mafia is involved in this. It's also used as a cover for commercial trade. Again, looking at the CITES trade database, it shows regular intervals that very precise numbers of crocodile skins have been entering Singapore as hunting trophies. So they've been entering as batches of 500, 1,000, 2,000, 2,500. And the question is, well, A, Singapore is a country that has no tradition of trophy hunting, but B, say, why is it that suddenly Singaporeans are supposedly so interested in Nile crocodiles to the exclusion of every other species? And isn't it remarkable that they're able to hunt them in such very precise numbers? So, it really does show the problem with the current international governance in relation to trophy hunting.
Thank you. So the next question has been sort of fairly well covered, but if anybody wants to add anything. So the question is there any research on a link between people who trophy hunt and other social pathologies or personality disorders, like there is a link between domestic abuse and animal abuse? So does anybody want to say anything further on that?
I don't know if Tanya wanted to say something, but just to say, if you associate, if you think that the dark triads associated with cruelty to animals and negative attitudes to animals, then we know that the dark triads also related to a whole series of human-related behaviors as well, including kind of domestic abuse and so on. So there's so that would be a kind of connecting thing, which is to do with underlying personality, and that would be my take on that. Tanya might have a different perspective on
that. No, thanks for that, Geoff. I thought very interesting, and I actually sent you a direct message because I think it's not directly related, but there's some really good psychology studies done by Daunt and Leida that have looked at speciesism in relation to other personality traits, and that's certainly relevant into how we commodify and exploit wildlife. So I think people are kind of touching around the edges of it, but it's something to be explored further.
Okay, and so I'll move on to the next question. Is trophy hunting inherently different from other forms of hunting? So in other words, is there a slippery slope argument to ban all forms of hunting, or should trophy hunting be considered as a separate entity?
Well, I can kick off again in that I sort of made some comments on the chat. I mean, I think it is something very different to, for example, subsistence hunting. There isn't any human material need that is being met by trophy hunting. It is purely a gratification, an emotional gratification for a very narrow group of people, a very small subsection of society. It is, there is no need that is being met. Certainly it's nothing to do with our survival. It's not providing us with any sort of material goods. And it is something that was invented relatively recently, certainly in its current form. It is a modern industry. It is very closely tied up with the development and expansion of colonialism and the attitudes that are behind that, and the sort of the domination and so on. And I think actually it is important to really highlight that it is an industry rather than it's the aberrant behavior of just a few individuals who then come to prominence because they post these pictures on social media. Organizations like Safari Club International actively encourage people to shoot very large numbers of animals. So all of their awards, of which they've got, well, a total of 80 awards categories and subcategories. You know, they're all about shooting multiple animals. And there's levels as well. So they've got a series of awards that are called Inner Circle Awards, and they go from copper, bronze, silver, gold, diamond. And it's just like a computer game or an arcade game. So, you know, to get to level 1, you have to shoot X number of animals. To then be able to get to level 2, you have to shoot Y numbers and then Z numbers of animals. And so an example of this is the Hunting Achievement Award. So where, you know, at gold level, you have to shoot animals from at least 100 species. To get the same prize. At diamond level, it's 125 different species. And the top award, which they call, without a shred of irony, they call it the World Conservation and Hunting Award. To get that prize, you have to have shot somewhere between 300 to 500 animals. And there are many people who have shot, you know, many more. I mean, probably the world's leading hunter at the moment, in terms of numbers, a chap called Tony Sanchez Areno. He's not American, he's Spanish. And he's got, at the last count, something like 1,317 elephants, 342 lions, 127 black rhinos, 167 leopards. He's got about 2,000 buffalo, etc., etc., etc. You know, and there's Marcel Gomez Siqueira, another Spanish hunter who's recently been in the news because he's been trying to open a museum so that the public can come and enjoy the spectacle of his vast collection of trophies, of which he has at least 2,000. So, you know, it is different. It's not in any way a natural impulse, a natural behavior. It is very much an industry, and one which generates a lot of money for the industry, not for local people. And there is this whole sort of pride associated with it. So, as I say, I think it's a very different and, shall we say, artificial behavior.
Yeah, I would say from a psychology point of view, it's qualitatively different as well. Because if you think about your inclusive fitness and conspicuous consumption, I mean, the costs of it make it different, I think, in terms of what it demonstrates. And in terms of what it does in terms of elevating self-esteem, in terms of narcissistic flow, then obviously trophy hunting works in a way that normal hunting wouldn't work. You know, it's something, to me, those images are a critical mechanism of keeping the thing in place. And I think the psychological function is kind of rooted in those images. If you liked, you know, going out and shooting rats or something, you couldn't display them in quite the same interesting way in terms of your self-esteem. It just wouldn't work. It's very different.
Yeah. So if these groups of people are existing in their own communities and their own media with their own awards, does that rather mean that there's no hope for them? Does that mean that the legislation is the only resort?
Well, I think legislation which has a strong deterrent will certainly deter some, and hopefully a large number, and hopefully it will also encourage us to really readdress our relationship with the natural world and our living planet, because I think the behaviors that are inherent in trophy hunting are in large part a key driver of the wider malaise that we face today in terms of the crisis of biodiversity, the climate crisis, and a lot of these issues have, you know, are very tied up with our attitude about where we sit in the natural world and what our rights are. It's very interesting that, you know, the language used by the hunting industry, it's all about protecting hunters' rights, protecting the freedom to hunt whatever we choose. And so this is very sort of individualistic, and I mean, there's a chap, Matthew Scully, he's a Republican in the US, and he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. But he, you know, wrote this very good book called Dominion, which actually looks at that whole relationship and why, and sometimes it's justified in biblical language as well, about, you know, how we sort of sit on top of the animal world, and that, you know, we have this liberty, which is almost sacrosanct, to go out and exploit nature for our own ends, whatever those ends may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is, you know, changing people's underlying deeper relationships with the environment and nature, and I think that can only be done through education. I think it's kind of educating people about how they connect to nature and the importance of it. Over the last few years, I've been exploring the importance of something which we call implicit attitudes. Not what people say, but these kind of deeper level emotional connections. But I think you can impact on those implicit attitudes to animals, to nature, to climate change. And I think we have to start at that kind of basic level. But I think we can also start at the level which is, look, if this is fueled by this kind of narcissism epidemic, then it's kind of, I think drawing attention to that, saying, look, this kind of display doesn't tell us anything about you as a courageous and worthy champion. It tells us something about this insecurity on your part. You know, it's almost like, I mean, and this has happened in the past, of course, with narcissism and fancy sports cars. Some people wouldn't dream of buying certain kinds of cars because it's been pointed out to them that there's something kind of just terribly artificial and embarrassing about it. And hopefully at some point people will see not just the guilt and shame of this, but the embarrassment of wanting to pose with animals, because it tells you something about how bloody insecure you are as an individual. It's like, so that's why I think there is a good psychological counter argument. You know, it doesn't make you look big, it just makes you look foolish. And why do you go and buy a bloody car? You know, buy a folly car if you have to, but buy a bloody car, you know, preferably an electric car, but not that. You don't have to kill something to make yourself feel good. You know, buy books, pile your books up high.
Really interesting discussion. I mean, I do think legislation is always, and regulation is always going to have a really important part to play. And of course, regulation can be part of the process of securing behaviour change. But I also agree that, you know, you've got to approach this from different angles and aspects. And what Geoff was saying about education, ultimately in changing the way people think and the way people view these things is really important. And I do think with the rise in public awareness, shall we say, and the rising sort of public opposition in many respects to trophy hunting, will hopefully start to have you know, some kind of impact on the behaviour of some of those who trophy hunt. The other thing about legislation that's interesting is, you know, we've talked a little bit today about the UK's DEFRA's proposals, which were just published at the end of last week. The detail of DEFRA's proposals to ban the import of trophies. It's not a blanket ban, but it's going to, if they introduce it as they say they're going to, it's going to be pretty comprehensive. Of course, that's a ban on the import of trophies. It doesn't prevent people from trophy hunting. It only prevents those of them that would want to bring the trophy back to the UK from bringing the trophy back. What will be interesting is to see whether those people continue to trophy hunt on the basis that they're satisfied that the photos they take that they can then post on social media are sufficient, or whether they will stop engaging in that activity because they can't physically bring the trophies home. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see the kind of impact that kind of legislation, which coming in the UK, it's coming in some other countries, might have on the behaviour of people from those countries who currently insist on trophy hunting.
Okay, thank you. And so there's a question about the impact of COVID. If you've seen any impact in the field of trophy hunting. So has it had any short or long-term effect?
Don't know what the long-term effect will be. I know that obviously, you know, far fewer hunters were able to travel from North America and Europe to Africa. It was quite, well, there's two things that happened. One was, as you might expect, but the industry would deny this, that actually that there was an apparent increase in wildlife populations. Now, of course, that's harmful to the industry's arguments that you need trophy hunting in order to preserve wildlife, where it seems that if you stop shooting them, that the populations will stabilize and recover. I mean, you know, who knew? But one of the other things is that although fewer external hunters were coming in, so some of the outfitters and the owners of the hunting estates just went and shot animals themselves. And there was one chap who I was reading an account where he said, well, actually, this is great because I could take my grandchildren hunting, and they went and had fun and shot these animals instead of our paying clients. It's difficult to see what the long-term picture will be, although I think that it's fair to assume that for the next few years, there will be a dampening of the international travel market and tourism overall. And so this will change things, but we don't quite know, I think, or we don't quite yet have a picture of what that might mean in the longer term.
Okay. And another question is there any effect on the trophy hunters of exposing them in the media? Does this curtail their activities?
Well, let me jump in again. I mean, I know that because obviously my organisation, the Campaign to Ban Trophy Hunting, we've been doing a lot of investigations about trophy hunting, the trophy hunting industry, and to trophy hunters, and a lot of this has appeared in the press, and that quite often the hunters are then horrified when the journalist rings them up and say, so look, you know, you wrote about this on this forum, that forum, you've posted pictures, and we're doing a story about your trophy hunting exploits, and you know, do you have a comment? And they're kind of like, oh my goodness, like as if they couldn't have imagined that somehow what they've written on, and these are, you know, you don't have to be a member of many of these sites, you know, africahunting.com, etc., to go on them and read about these accounts which they write and the photos which they post on there. But it does, they do like to operate in the shadows. They don't like to be seen out in public. And I think this is sort of key to the politics of the issue. And why trophy hunting has survived, because, you know, the trophy hunting industry is very powerful. It's got a lot of money. You know, it's spent something like £100 million in the last 10 years or so in lobbying. And a lot of that money has gone into campaign coffers of American politicians, and all sorts of operations, including setting up fake conservation groups and running, you know, fake news, social media platforms, and so on and so forth. But you don't see them out in the open. You know, they're not actively promoting trophy hunting. They operate in the shadows, so they are, you know, they're putting money into the pockets of some scientists, and they're, you know, they're doing things which, because they don't, as soon as the issue comes out into the public reacts. I mean, the vast majority of people in Britain, in America, in Germany, everywhere you look, are absolutely horrified by trophy hunting and opposed to it. So they don't actually want the issue to come out into the public. They try to do all of their lobbying, and they do a lot of lobbying. I mean, the Safari Club's PAC, the Political Action Committee, so that's basically its election fund. I mean, it's bigger than that of General Motors, of Delta Airlines. So they're putting huge amounts of money into the system. You know, they create these lobby groups on Capitol Hill, like the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, which has got half of America's governors and half of the members of Congress on there. But when it comes to openly being out there, they don't like the glare of publicity. They're like vampires. They suddenly sort of disappear and vanish. And yeah, so I think that putting the spotlight on them is making them rethink, or making a lot of people think again, perhaps, because I think they don't realize just how out of touch they are. It was interesting when I was writing a book recently about trophy hunters, and I said that I was a trophy hunter, and I rang up various British trophy hunters, and there was almost this sense of relief that they'd found a common spirit, you know, a fellow traveller, that they were able to talk about it with somebody who was like them. So, you know, it's very interesting. I think that it will become seen in the future as something in the, you know, in the same frame as apartheid, as slavery, as bear baiting, as dog fighting, as something that people, you know, future generations will think, my goodness, that really happened in the 21st century. I mean, people will just, I think, feel it was an aberration, and thank goodness it's been shut down.
Okay, and related to that, there's a question about social media. Should the big social media companies, should they ban people being able to post images of hunters and with their prey?
I think social media companies should do a lot of things, and that's certainly one thing which would have an immediate kind of impact on the activities. To be honest, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, that affirmation and support is absolutely necessary. But I think there is some, speaking from a psychologist's point of view, there's so much more that social media companies need to do. They need to take responsibility, I think, for a whole series of things.
Okay, and we're running out of time, but maybe we could fit in just another one or two questions. So is it more realistic to support a total ban or a phased ban? And what would you prefer to see? How would you see it working in reality?
Well, I think a total ban, an immediate one, because not least because the government has announced its intentions some time ago. And so there is already strong awareness in the hunting community about the fact that the ban is coming. And again, some of the trophy hunters that I've spoken to were talking about how they were hurrying up, not just to get their shooting done, but to get their trophies back to Britain as quickly as possible, because they were thinking that the door, would be closing very soon. So, and it's also interesting when you talk to some and read some of their accounts that they've almost accepted that this ban is going to happen. That they sort of realize that a ban is going to be introduced by the UK government, and so they're not quite sure what they're going to do next, but they've sort of accepted defeat in a way on this one. And so look, I don't think a phasing is going to change very much at all. As I say, the hunting industry is very aware of what's coming. And they're kind of ready for it, and they know about it largely because, of course, a lot of them have been trying to get their members to write to the government to protest and say, don't do this; it'll have all sorts of terrible consequences, etc. So I don't think there's a lack of awareness that would justify a phasing in. And I think, it should be brought in, not least because, every week that goes by without this ban means more animals are being killed by British trophy hunters and their trophies brought back to Britain. We're not just talking about a hypothetical thing here. We're talking about animals' lives. And, in many of these cases, animals are suffering, tremendously cruel and painful deaths, largely because of partly because of the rise in the use of novelty weapons like handguns and longbows, etc., to shoot big game animals like elephants and lions, and that's just making problems in terms of the animal welfare side even worse.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there's any reason why a ban, and if we're talking about the UK ban on the import of hunting trophies, should not be brought in its entirety. There's no rationale for phasing. But the only thing I'd say is what we need to do in parallel with this is, and it's not in recognition of any real value of trophy hunting to conservation, but we do need to be continuing to push our government and the international community to review the resourcing and financing of biodiversity protection. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, a really serious biodiversity crisis. We're in danger of losing tens, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million species over the coming years if we don't act, and we don't act now. And bear in mind that the UK is classed as one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So, it's not something that's happening somewhere else. It's something that has already happened and continues to happen here as well. So, we mustn't take our eye off that ball. But, so it is a case of looking at all the options. There are many, many ways you can do this much, much, much more effectively than by allowing, as I say, wealthy trophy hunters to pay a few $1,000s to kill animals, in terms of providing the resources we need to protect biodiversity.
I think that's a really striking point to end on. So just to wrap up, I don't know if the speakers, if any points of discussion or any questions, if there's anything you want to sort of share amongst yourselves that have come up in the talks. Of any points raised, otherwise we'll end the panel questions there. So just remains for me to thank everybody for joining and watching, and thank our speakers. So, thank you for your talks, but also thank you for the work that you do. And thank you to Excel Vets and Denise for hosting us. And I think today's just been a really good example of why AWSELVA works as an organisation, because we do bring together these different elements that don't often get discussed in tandem. So, elements of ethics and reasoning and investigation and the criminology side, all coming back to animal welfare. So thank you for everybody being part of AWSELVA and contributing to the content that we can put out to our audience. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
So